The word bearers in Warhammer 40k are the high priests of the Chaos powers, leading hordes of cultists in a never-ending battle against the Imperium. But originally, they were one of the few legions the Emperor created with a direct purpose, a purpose in complete opposition to what they eventually became. Hiya, welcome to Heresy 101. In this little series, I'm going to go through the lore for each of Warhammer's Space Marine legions, particularly their origin in the grim days of the Horus Heresy. I'll take a look at where they are at the start of the Heresy and how they got there, so it's worth saying that this is a lore video and therefore contains spoilers for many of the background books and especially the Black Library novel series. The 17th Legion were one of the few legions given an outright task at their founding, being assigned one of the most important roles within the Imperium, the upholding of the Imperial Truth. But over time, that task was twisted and their zeal redirected until they became the very thing they'd been created to stop. The story of the 17th Legion, like all the legions, starts during the Unification Wars on Terra as the Emperor reforged the planet according to his great plan. But while on the surface his designs were for the reunification of all humanity and the Great Crusade the means to achieve that, in reality there was a subtler and in many ways more important reason to impose his Imperium. And that was the Imperial Truth. The Emperor was aware that the biggest threat to humanity's continued existence was chaos, the raw power of the warp, and the malign intelligences that dwelt within it. Throughout the long span of interstellar history, humanity had become exposed to this danger in a number of ways. Interstellar travel relied on direct interaction with the warp. The increased emergence of psychic powers in humanity, while useful, had damned entire worlds through a lack of control, but most often the real danger of the warp came through superstition and worship. The powers of chaos, the great unknowable entities that lived in the warp, were easy to mistake for gods. And over the long span of human history, plenty of religions and cults had existed who, often unknowingly, had dedicated their every action to warp entities, inviting the power of the warp into real space in exchange for temporary power over others. This was what had to be stopped. The Emperor had a plan for each of these exposures, from the Sisters of Silence and the Black Ships to his secret Webway project, but the Imperial Truth was the most widely known, the complete outlawing and refutation of any superstition or religion and the casting down of its trappings. His Imperium would be a secular one, and the 17th Legion would be one of the tools by which that would be achieved. The Legion was named the Imperial Heralds at their genesis, and their recruits were taken from the orphan sons of those regions of terror that had resisted compliance and fought the Emperor. Some other legions had a similar recruitment base, such as the 13th, whose gene seed encouraged cooperation and deference to authority. But with the 17th, that ire and hatred was redirected towards a new target. While all the Legiones Astartes fought with utter devotion, the warriors of the 17th carried with them an air of zealotry. For them, there was no joy in battle, no glory in conquest. All that mattered was their duty be done. While others might acknowledge and even respect their foes, the 17th saw no virtue in defiance. Only once a foe was broken and bowed in repentance could they be accepted as deserving anything but ruin. In the Great Crusade, they forged an efficient and bloody path, directed against those human populations Crusade Command judged unlikely to adopt compliance, or whose beliefs were so antithetical to the Imperium that they needed to be removed from history. The Imperial Heralds, mindful of the symbology of war, would commence their campaigns in the same way each time. A lone officer of the Legion, wearing the symbolic skull mask and winged mace, would be sent ahead of the Legion, speaking of the truth offered by the Emperor and the futility of resistance, and deliver their ultimatum: recant or be destroyed. If this request was unheeded or denied, then annihilation would follow, the 17th Legion falling on the world and burning every scrap of its culture to ash in its wake, its fanes and temples destroyed, and its statues and devotional idols cast down. Amongst the armies of the Great Crusade, they were known as the Iconoclasts. For them, war wasn't just a test of arms or a chance to conquer and hold territory, it was ideological. The reasons they fought and the lessons their victories enforced were the most important ways to safeguard the Imperial Truth and, by extension, the Imperium itself. And so when the Imperium finally discovered their Primarch on the arid planet of Colchis, we might be forgiven for expecting a reckoning. In the later years of the Unification Wars on Terra, as the armies of the Imperium cast down the sects and cults that flourished across Old Earth, the Emperor had begun his Astartes project by creating 20 Primarchs, beings that mix the power of the warp with the greatest of human science. These Primarchs were to be his generals, and each of them provided the genetic template for one of the Astartes legions. But before production of the legions was fully underway, the Primarchs were scattered through the warp in a great calamity and came to rest on various planets across the galaxy. Colchis, landing site of the 17th Primarch, was a large and hot planet, a desert world, whose population laboured under the yoke of a religious priesthood known as the Covenant, who dedicated themselves to the worship of the primordial truth, chaos in all but name. But the young Primarch, coming into the care of a minor priest and named Loregar by his adoptive father, knew better. In his dreams, he experienced visions of a golden figure, a being greater than any mortal human, a being of light and knowledge spreading unity throughout the stars. But this being he saw in his dreams wasn't any secular hero. Such a thing was unthinkable within the culture of Colchis. Instead, Loregar saw these dreams as prophetic of a new god, a single god of light and order, and it was to him he dedicated his worship. He was raised amongst the priesthood, but in the end turned against them, leading a crusade in the name of the new one god. When the expeditionary fleets finally arrived, they were met by a world united by faith in the Imperium and faith in its ruler, the Emperor. Ascribing divinity to the Emperor wasn't an uncommon belief at the time. The policing of the Imperial Truth had never been perfect, and many populations newly liberated by the Imperium couldn't rationalize their fate any other way. But despite this, and realizing the position he was expected to hold, Loregar, at least on the surface, ceased his preaching of the divine. The worship of idols, the practices of mystics, and the falseness of countless gods all were condemned without measure, but on the nature of his lord and father, Loregar remained silent. But over time it became clear that Loregar hadn't abandoned his belief in the power of faith to unite humanity. After all, even if he wasn't of divine origins, didn't the Emperor's powers make him a god by any other name? Slowly, as he grew to know and lead his legion, his reason and oratory started to win them over. The Golden Primarch had a genius for speaking to men's hearts, and his campaigns to win those hearts were as subtle and thorough as any of those fought by the likes of Fulgrim and Guillermin on the battlefield. The Imperial Heralds had always been zealots, dedicated to purging the false beliefs of the Emperor's enemies. It wasn't a great step to replace them with new beliefs, the correct beliefs. The Legion would be the tool Loregar used to spread his word to the disparate strands of humanity, his word bearers, and the planets they brought into compliance prove the new Primarch's skill in matters of persuasion. Each was rebuilt from the ground up, a model of loyalty and pride in their place within the Imperium, and every one united in the glory of the God Emperor. The Legion's crusade took them far away from the centre of Imperial power, and it took many decades for this to become widely known, and in that time, the pace of the Word-Bearers' conquests had slowed to a crawl. They spent so much time rebuilding and indoctrinating that they started to fall behind the other legions, but when the reasons for this did become known, it was met by a mixture of fury and embarrassment, and calls for censure. Ankur, a devoted and faithful world brought into compliance by the 17th, its revered god emperor decided to set an example for the word-bearers. He chose as his hand the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, whose Primarch was known as level-headed, temperate and honourable. And on the Emperor's orders, they evacuated the devotional city of Monarchia and obliterated its shrines and temples from orbit. In the dust of the ruined city, the word-bearers were called to abase themselves and were ordered to put aside their religion and re-embrace the Imperial Truth. The Legion were humiliated and chastened in front of their brother legions, the commanders of the Great Crusade, and the Emperor himself. This harsh lesson certainly had an effect on the word-bearers and their Primarch, but not one the Imperium intended. Immediately after, Loregar retired to his rooms within his flagship, pondering the best way to proceed. In the end, for whatever reasons, he decided on a pilgrimage, a spiritual journey of focus and clarity, a journey that would take him into the Eye of Terror, where the warp and real space overlapped. But rather than breaking his faith, This pilgrimage reinforced it. Here, in the shifting powers of chaos, were gods that would accept his worship. Real gods, true gods, the gods cultists worshipped long ago. When the pilgrimage was over and the word-bearers returned to the Crusade, they were a changed legion. To the Imperium, they seemed almost eager to atone for their previous mistakes. Forging onward, bringing world after world into compliance at a speed never before seen, waging war after war in the name of the Imperium. But in reality, the Legion was exultant in its service to new masters, and many of those compliances were wars of extermination, fought for no other reason than to provide a sacrifice to their new gods. The slow fall of the traitor legions began here, and the galaxy was set on a path that would end in the Horus Heresy. The strength and disposition of the Word-Bearers' forces at the end of the Great Crusade is one of the hardest ones to estimate. Since their rediscovery of chaos, they'd been covertly building their forces, so while on paper they were thought to be around 140,000 strong, in reality this was closer to 200,000, with a massively upscaled fleet including significant new capital ships. Their warriors were divided first by chapter and then by company and by squad, with companies and sometimes even whole chapters being dedicated to particular roles. In fact, the makeup of a chapter might have symbolic status. The chapter of the Broken Scythe comprised artillery companies, siege tanks and mechanized flamer units to level cities and scour them to ashes. Tactical squads were very common across the board, and all squads were kept at very high strengths, which was to prove useful when hiding their numbers. Amongst the officer class, chaplains were extremely common, preaching the word of Loregar and encouraging the faithful to ritual acts in honor of the gods. They also proved invaluable in controlling the hordes of cultists and militia that followed them. The 17th had always made use of bonded auxiliaries, but after their reinvention, these became little more than hordes of faithful zealots culled from planets converted to the worship of chaos, and they were seen more and more as the heresy rolled on. As I've said in other episodes, though we call it the Horus Heresy, the seeds of it were planted not by Horus, but by Loregar and his advisors. His adoptive father raised to the Legion, Corpheron, and his first chaplain, Erebus. After the humiliation of Monarchia and their rediscovery of the Chaos powers, they spread a web of deceit amongst the legions, sending out chaplains to advise the Primarks and working to destabilize the legions through the spreading of warrior lodges. It was the Word-Bearers who eventually stole a powerful demon weapon from the human culture called the Interrex, leading to a needless war of compliance, and then engineered a series of events that left Horus wounded by the weapon and open to suggestion and corruption by the Chaos powers. From there, they continued to advise behind the scenes as Horus's initial moves played out, betraying the Loyalist legions during the Drop Site massacre on Isstvan V, and eventually revenging themselves upon the Ultramarines Legion during the Battle of Calth, where their great betrayal and slaughter of their brothers allowed them to raise the Ruin Storm, a warp storm that cut off many of the Loyalist legions from the centre of the war and stopped them reaching Terra in time to assist. From there, the Word-Bearers were at the forefront of Horus's war, openly preaching the glory of chaos and making sacrifice to the dark gods as they fought. It was Loregar who led the Shadow Crusade through Ultramar that eventually ended in the devotion of Angron and his World Eaters Legion to Khorne, turning the Primarch into a demon prince, while Word-Bearers demonologists were seeded throughout the traitor legions, teaching them how to navigate these new warp storms. But when Horus was wounded at Beta Garmon and the traitor forces seemed close to collapse, Loregar grew disillusioned at the War Master's refusal to fully submit to the forces of chaos. While Horus recovered, he gathered the traitor commanders and attempted to lead a coup, but Horus had been warned and betrayed by some of his own sons. Loregar was defeated and exiled. He played no part in the Siege of Terra, but Word-Bearers loyal to Horus did fight alongside their brother legions, assaulting the walls at the head of hordes of screaming cultists. And that's the 17th Legion, a legion dedicated to the necessary work of stamping out false belief, only to be convinced that they should replace those with new ones, by a Primarch so sure of the uniting ability of faith that he would accept any power as a focus for it. That the Horus Heresy happened at all is less a result of the great power of chaos and more of the folly of Loregar and the failure of the Imperial Truth. Thanks for watching. So if you'd like to see more of these, just a few left now, there should be another one just coming up to the right there, and if you'd like to see videos early or support the channel, then click the Patreon link in the description below. See ya!